The world of wildlife can often be unfriendly to humans, mainly due to the fact that we, so to speak, rational beings, shamelessly invade the habitats of animals and introduce our own rules and regulations there. Although nature in turn can inflict terrible revenge on us, and so powerfully that the entire genus Homo sapiens faces hardship. Even more so, the threat can sometimes come from a small and almost imperceptible creature, which at the same is able to constantly inflict serious damage as a dangerous disease on a person. We are talking about malaria, which infects hundreds of millions of people around the world every year and kills hundreds of thousands. Furthermore, until now, the best scientists in the world have not been able to produce a 100% effective vaccine or medicine that could fight malaria. Yes, studies are carried out regularly. A lot of money is invested in them. But even now, in the technologically and scientifically advanced 21st century, it has not yet been possible to achieve a positive result. Meanwhile, malaria is the 5th most contagious disease in the world when it comes to the number of deaths it causes. At least 200 million new cases of disease are recorded every year. Statistics say that in 2021, 247 million people were infected with it. More than 600,000 died. It is estimated that one child dies of malaria every 2 minutes worldwide. That's just the official data, and the real ones can be even scarier. Actually, the risk of coming down with malaria affects, mind it, at least 3.3 billion people on the planet. 1/3 of that number accounts for states with more than one case per 1,000 population. That is, every 8th inhabitant of the Earth can potentially become infected with malaria today and become a carrier of infection for many other people. These are truly appalling and catastrophic numbers. The word malaria is translated from Italian as bad air. They used to believe that it was the cause of many infectious diseases, and this disease was also known as swamp fever. In fact, this name is much more suitable for it, since it was in the swamps that the carriers of malaria, namely Anopheles mosquitoes, accumulated in huge quantities. Although they, biting a person, are just carriers of the infection, its causative agent is Plasmodium parasites, most often Plasmodium falciparum. Scientists believe that malaria originated in Central and West Africa. These territories are the best breeding ground for the spread of the disease so far, although mosquitoes that spread this disease can live in almost all climatic zones, except for the coldest and most deserted. They prefer swampy areas where there is a lot of rainfall the most. Under these conditions, they multiply much faster and accordingly spread Plasmodium more actively. Therefore, their traditional habitat is the equatorial and subequatorial zones, as well as the subtropics. Numerous analyses indicate that the distant ancestor of Plasmodium belonged to the protozoa category and first learned to live in the intestines of aquatic invertebrates. Then, about 150 to 200 million years ago, it moved into the larva of the first blood-sucking insects from the Diptera order. At the moment, the oldest fossils of malarial mosquitoes, in which the remains of Plasmodium falciparum were found, are 30 million years old. That is, the disease originated when the human did not yet exist. With its appearance, the parasite found a way to move into a new organism. Most likely, this happened during the existence of the hominin subfamily, to which Homo sapiens, gorillas, and chimpanzees belong. At that time, about 2 to 3 million years ago, Plasmodia even purposefully mutated in order to gain a foothold in the organisms of these creatures even more reliably. This is only one of many versions. There are others. For example, in Sudan, Africa, a 145,000-year-old human skull was found. Analysis showed that he was infected with malaria. However, some scientists reject this hypothesis, believing that in reality the disease is much younger. It is no more than 40 to 60,000 years old. It was the gorilla who suffered from a malarial mosquito bite from all hominins, and only then it was the human's turn. The main symptoms of the disease are fever, with the patient's body temperature sometimes rising to a virtually fatal 42 degrees, constant shivering attacks, and terrible convulsions. The disease is also characterized by the fact that it has a chronic course with relapses. Death from malaria usually causes numerous complications. It can be damage to the brain or its edema, cerebral malaria, a significant increase in the spleen. It can even burst like a grenade, and the liver, kidney failure. Respiratory organs often suffer as excess fluid accumulates in the lungs. There are complications in the form of anemia, blood deficiency, because the parasite infects red blood cells with its poison, as well as a sharp drop in blood sugar. This situation most often results in coma and death. Therefore, it is very important to provide medical care in the case of malaria within the first 24 hours after the onset of said symptoms. Otherwise, it can be difficult to save the patient. Physicians were lucky to identify the source of the disease only in the late 19th century, when the French military physician Charles Laveran, who used to live in Algeria, discovered an until then unknown living unicellular organism in the blood of a malaria patient. So, in 1880, Plasmodium was introduced to the world, and the scientists received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1907. The name for the parasite came up a little later, in 1895, by Italian scientists Ettore Machiafava and Angelo Celli. In 1894, Scottish parasitologist Patrick Manson hypothesized that malaria could be transmitted to humans through mosquito bites. His colleague, the British Ronald Ross, in 1898, while in India, found that some varieties of these insects transmit swamp fever to birds. He even managed to isolate plasmodia from the salivary glands of mosquitoes, as well as to find parasites in the intestines of insects. At that time, the scientist failed to do one thing: to trace exactly how Plasmodium travels into the human body. In the same year, the Italian zoologist and entomologist Giovanni Grassi decided on a bold experiment. He infected a group of volunteers, including himself, with malaria through a mosquito bite. As a result, it was proved that only Anopheles mosquitoes were the parasite carriers. However, the 1902 Nobel Prize was still awarded to Ross, because his hypothesis was confirmed and supported by the majority of physicians of that time. Malaria is characterized by 3 modes of transmission. The most common is transmissible when a mosquito bites an infected person and transmits it to a healthy one. This happens to 85% of cases. In other episodes, it is referred to the transmission of the infection to the fetus during the mother's pregnancy, the so-called congenital malaria, much less often, through blood transfusion and organ transplantation. Interestingly, scientists knew about the life stages of Plasmodium at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, but, as it turned out, the parasite could still spring surprises. So only in the 1980s, science became aware that it was able to stay in the human body for a long time in the so-called resting stage. That is, to behave as quietly as possible, and then suddenly appear sharply. This discovery made it possible to understand why a person who had already had malaria in one form or another could become ill again after some time. It must be admitted that scientists were not ready for such a course of events. Many studies had to be revised, taking into account the new factor. And this happened 100 years after the world got acquainted with the causative agent of malaria. Physicians were once again convinced that Plasmodium was not such a simple organism as it might seem at first glance, but rather cunning and able to adapt. This is also evidenced by the fact that the parasite, getting into the body of its victim, literally forces it to produce certain substances that will attract other mosquitoes. Scientists have established this by conducting a series of experiments on rodents. It turned out that Plasmodium changed the smell of their body, and it became especially strong when the parasites fully matured. 4 species are dangerous for humans: Plasmodium vivax, P. ovale, P. malariae, and P. falciparum. There is also a 5th type of malaria parasite, Plasmodium knowlesi, but it is mainly observed in Southeast Asia and rarely leaves its borders. Female mosquitoes, when bitten, inject the pathogen into the human blood or lymphatic system. From there, after a short period of time, the parasites enter the liver, where they begin to multiply actively. In effect, thousands and even tens of thousands can appear from one microbe. It's clear that then the liver becomes crowded with them, and they further penetrate the circulatory system. Usually it happens after a few weeks. However, this is only if the disease develops traditionally. Individual strains can manifest in the blood after 8 to 10 months, while others sleep in the liver for years before leaving this habitat. It is then that a person who seems to have no signs of malaria at all experiences an attack of the illness, and a quick diagnosis of the patient becomes a matter of life and death. This happens with the help of checking blood films, which allow the detection of malaria parasites. Today there are two types. The advantage of a thin smear is that it is easier and more reliable to determine which type of Plasmodium has invaded a person's body. A thick smear, on the other hand, makes it possible to study a larger volume of the patient's blood, but at the same time, there are problems with determining the variety of the parasite. Besides, in recent decades, there have also appeared rapid malaria tests that use immunochemical elements. They give a result within only 10 to 15 minutes, but are quite expensive, just like PCR tests for detecting malaria. This factor, especially in the poorest countries that suffer from malaria most, prevents timely diagnosis, and people die from the disease much more often than in developing and civilized ones. It should be borne in mind that malaria itself does not exist in one variety, but in several. All of them differ in symptoms, incubation period, and course of the disease. The most dangerous and common, about 90%, form is tropical, in which the causative agent is Plasmodium falciparum. It is characterized by exceedingly terrible complications and a high mortality rate. Most often, the disease occurs in tropical Africa, East Asia, and South America. Without treatment, it can last up to a year, with a possibility of early relapses. Plasmodium malariae is the causative agent of 4-day malaria. It is mainly distributed in the same regions as the tropical one, but in the Middle East instead of South America. Without treatment, it usually lasts up to 3 years. There is a possibility of early relapse manifestations. Complications are possible, although this form of the disease is still not as dangerous as tropical. The same applies to 3-day malaria, tropics of Africa, Indochina, Afghanistan, New Guinea, Philippines, and ovale malaria, Iraq, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Syria, provoked by Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale, respectively, although the risk of dying from these malaria varieties is also quite high if they are recognized too late. The fact that immunity against the disease develops slowly, over several years, is causing great concern. But in the course of this process, the risk of being infected with malaria again, and even repeatedly, is quite large, especially when new types and strains of it arise in nature. According to scientists, this is due to the fact that the human immune system is unable to cope with Plasmodium, which remains in the body for a long time. This contributes to a permanent weakening of immunity, and our T cells are not always able to effectively fight the causative agent of malaria. I found another interesting hypothesis for you. During the study of Plasmodium malariae, scientists from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, found that in the early stages of its existence, this organism infected only African monkeys, although for some reason, about 5,000 years ago, it mutated and learned to transmit malaria to people. According to the researchers, the ancestors of modern humans appeared about 200,000 years ago in Africa, then began to migrate and develop other territories, so 5,000 years is a very short time in historical perspective. To conduct the study, the scientists took DNA samples from P. malaria-infected chimpanzees. The results were shocking. This type of infection included not one type of parasite, but 3 at once. P. malariae specializes in transmitting the disease to humans, while the other 2, P. salatum and P. primulariae, to great apes. This is the reason for the hypothesis that 5,000 years ago, malaria parasites evolved, and the type of P. malariae appeared, which caused the human malaria as well. So, the history of the disease is constantly supplemented by a number of facts, and this is alarming. After all, the less you know about the nature of malaria, the less likely it is to overcome. Of course, over the centuries, mankind has repeatedly looked for ways to defeat this terrible disease. Wormwood was considered the first known medicine against malaria. In ancient China, a prescription for malaria was first mentioned about 2,000 years ago. And even more specifically, the use of this plant was described in the work of the scientist Zhiwang, Recipe Book for Emergency Care, 340. The process of discovering the antidote was significantly accelerated while European navigators studied the American continent. Then it was discovered that the tribes of the local native Indians used cinchona bark as an antipyretic. As the Spanish missionary and naturalist Bernabé Cobo was convinced of the effectiveness of the remedy, he brought it to Europe in 1632, and from that moment on, the era of quinine in the fight against malaria began. Quinine itself, as an active element, was isolated from the bark of a tree only in 1820 by French chemists Joseph Caventou and Pierre Pelletier. Later, the scientists even opened a plant for the production of quinine, the raw materials for which were supplied from South America. At the same time, none of them began to patent the discovery and did not strive for commerce. They only wanted the tool for saving people from death to spread. Altruism is unprecedented in our time, isn't it? Quinine really noticeably helped to stop the spread of the disease on the planet, but obviously not at the pace that the civilized world was counting on. This state of affairs persisted in the 20th century, when different methods of solving the problem were suggested, but the effectiveness of the means used was highly questionable. Unfortunately, science has not advanced at a rapid pace, although scientists have almost come to some revolutionary conclusions. These include the developments of Chinese researcher Tu Youyou, who has devoted many years to working with ancient treatises on medicine in her country, and since 1969 has purposefully searched for a prescription specifically for malaria. Together with a group of like-minded people in 1972, she looked through thousands of documents and eventually found that a decoction of the time-honored wormwood could be effective in this case. And so it happened. Researchers isolated a substance called kingosa from it, and the resulting medicine is now known in European and American practice as artemisinin. Kingosa was able to destroy plasmodia in the human body, even in the early stages of malaria. Later, Tu Youyou's group isolated other derivative substances that had even greater power in the fight against the disease, and in 1979, the tests were completed that confirmed the effectiveness of the medications developed. The scientists from China received the Nobel Prize for that. However, this happened only in 2015. There is a problem. The matter is that medicines obtained from sweet wormwood extract are expensive at the very stage of production and hit the market already at a substantial price. And according to Médecins Sans Frontières, the average cost of treating a patient with malaria in many African countries, and especially the poorest, is less than $1. As far as the preparation is concerned, it is much more expensive, and therefore the main obstacle to reducing the impact of the disease on the planet remains the high cost of treatment. Does anyone really have little interest in seeing malaria leave our world forever? At the same time, it is impossible not to mention one more sad circumstance. According to the World Health Organization, at least 250,000 people die every year on the planet who took counterfeit medicines and vaccines against malaria. It is clear that some live according to the rule, nothing personal, it's just business. But when it comes to such a number of victims of illegal pharmaceuticals, among whom there are children, something needs to be done with this turnover of fakes. The current environmental conditions also affect the spread of the disease. We are talking about uncontrolled deforestation in a number of countries or even across entire continents. This has been proven to have led to serious malaria outbreaks in African Kenya. Water accumulated on the ground at higher temperatures, which is the favorite environment for parasitic mosquitoes. Approximately the same thing happened in South American Brazil and Peru, and only after the local authorities took up the development of green areas, the situation was stabilized. However, even today, not all states understand the danger of deforestation, and this remains a major problem on a global scale. Well, back to the essence of the issue, or rather, the symptoms of malaria. If, during the examination of the patient, the physician discovers clinical signs of the disease, he or she prescribes a series of laboratory tests. Usually these are blood, including biochemical, and urine tests, ultrasound of the abdominal organs to see liver swelling and splenic growth, X-rays of the chest and respiratory organs, as well as tests to detect anti-malarial antibodies. If the disease is confirmed, measures to counteract the disease are reduced to drug-free modalities: bed rest, a certain diet, and increased fluid intake. The use of drugs such as primaquine and artesunate, along with antibiotics and drips. The main thing at this stage is to recognize which particular variety of the malaria parasite caused the disease, because some of them completely stopped responding to traditional medicines. Despite all the efforts of pharmacists, today quinine is still one of the most effective substances in the fight against this deadly disease. For a certain time, they tried to use chloroquine as a substitute, but it did not live up to their expectations because in Asia, Africa, and other continents, Plasmodium mutated again and developed immunity to the substance. As we said, the virus is very cunning and tenacious. In fact, at this stage, mankind has not come up with anything better than using quinine and artemisinin in combination with some other substances for the treatment and prevention of malaria. In this combination, they are a little more effective, but this is clearly not enough to overcome the infection. Although experimental drugs are constantly being developed by scientists around the world, many of them do not stand up to scrutiny after being tested. No, I am not at all suggesting that physicians and researchers are not doing enough to defeat malaria, although for various reasons they still lack a sufficient practical basis for a full-fledged study of the disease. That is why it slows down very slightly if we talk about the real-world experience. Also, health experts warn that far less money is allocated for malaria prevention and treatment than necessary, and we're talking about billions of dollars annually. In the 21st century, the development of vaccines against malaria is still receiving increased attention. For example, back in 2003, the start of work on a preparation called PFSPZ, abbreviation of Plasmodium falciparum sporozoides, was announced, which is produced by the American company Malaria. It was based not only on antigens, but also on weakened Plasmodia parasites, so the vaccine is, so to speak, live. In 2017, it was reported that at the first stage of testing, the drug showed 90% effectiveness, and when combined with chloroquine, all 100%. Most recently, in mid-January 2023, the results of testing the effect of PFSPZ on residents of endemic, that is, the most prone to malaria infection areas of Africa, were published. And it turned out that initially the vaccine showed 90% effectiveness. After 6 months, the figure dropped to 48%, and after 18 months to 46%. It is clear that Malaria will continue to develop in this direction, and hopefully, the performance of the drug will improve over time. Since 2015, the anti-malaria medication DSM-265, developed by scientists from the University of Texas Northwestern Medical Center, the Institute of Pharmacology, the University of Washington, Monash University, and the Medicines for Malaria Venture, has been undergoing trials. The researchers argue that a single dose of the medication will be enough to cure malaria patients, because it kills parasites in both the blood and liver of the human with one blow. In 2019, a team of scientists from the University of Basel, Switzerland, conducted research and administered the DSM-265 vaccine to 8 volunteers infected with malaria. As a result, one of them did not develop an infection at all, and the rest of the participants in the experiment were given an additional dose of the medication. Success! After that, their organisms were practically cleaned of parasites. The same year, scientists at the Vaccine and Gene Therapy Institute in Oregon, USA, presented a malaria vaccine that reduced the release of parasites from the liver into the blood by 75 to 80% in a group of 16 experimental rhesus monkeys. It turned out that the drug has the ability to produce memory T cells that seek out and eliminate infected cells in the body. Moreover, this treatment allows vaccinated monkeys to maintain a fairly high level of immunity to malaria for years. In the summer of 2015, the European Medicines Agency gave a positive review of the Mosquirix vaccine, which was developed in the UK and tested on more than 15,000 children. It was administered to them 4 times, at 0, 1, 2, and 20 months, and then the medication took effect around 30 to 40%. On October 6, 2021, the World Health Organization recommended that the Mosquirix vaccine be used worldwide. It is also effective against any disease caused by the presence of parasites in the body. After testing, they trialed the medication in African countries, Kenya, Malawi, and Ghana. More than 2.3 million doses were administered to approximately 800,000 children. The result was remarkable. The number of children protected from the disease increased from less than 70% to over 90%. As late as in 2020, UK and Kenya infectious disease specialists, during the course of the research, discovered a microorganism belonging to the class of fungi that blocks the spread of malaria. It was identified on the shores of Lake Victoria in Kenya when studying the behavior of malarial mosquitoes, and this bacterium was found in the intestines and genitals of the insects. Scientists do not yet know exactly how this microorganism functions, but there is a version that the bacterium causes a response to the mosquito's immune system, and it can more effectively fight parasites that try to take over its body. Researchers believe that if at least 40% of malarial mosquitoes are artificially infected with the bacterium, this will help to significantly slow down the course of the disease on the African continent. Genetic engineering is back in rotation. Science does not stand still. Everybody is well aware that with the help of experiments and vaccination, the problem of the spread of malaria in the world cannot be solved. That is why scientists devote a lot of their time and effort to the development and implementation of preventive measures to further combat the disease. This usually means the use of already existing medications that need to be taken by residents of regions where malaria holds strong positions, but this is not always possible due to their high price or people traveling to these countries. At the same time, it is necessary to introduce drugs into the diet at least 2 weeks before entering the risk zone and go on using them after returning, preferably within a month. However, there are other ways to prevent malaria, which have been used for many years in endemic regions of the disease. One of them is the physical destruction of mosquitoes that carry the infection. For example, when malaria was common in the U.S. and Southern Europe, people solved the problem by improving sanitation by draining the swamps. As long as in 2002, only 1,059 cases of the disease were registered in the United States, of which 8 were fatal. After this, disease in the territory of this country manifested itself even less frequently. Until now, in regions where malaria is a frequent visitor, especially in Africa and Asia, the local population uses ordinary mosquito nets. Despite the fact that the method seems extremely simple, it is effective. But it is better to spray the nets with insecticides at the same time. This helps to keep parasite carriers outside the home. It is also recommended to wear most covered clothing and use insect repellents, both chemical and natural. Essential oils of some plants are suitable. But these are, so to speak, methods of protection available to ordinary people. The scientists, of course, are busy with more global developments. In particular, they are engaged in the fact that they have long been trying to nurture the so-called transgenic mosquitoes. The present-day academic community is starting to run out of ideas for ways to deal with insects that spread diseases. Insecticides are failing because of resistance. We haven't come up with a way to make better repellents, and we don't yet have vaccines that work well enough against most mosquito-borne diseases to be useful. The emphasis in the fight against insect vectors must be done on genetic engineering methods, said Leslie Vosshall, an associate at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Maryland, USA, and chief of a laboratory at Rockefeller University. In 2007, the PNAS magazine published an article, "Transgenic malaria-resistant mosquitoes have a fitness advantage when feeding on Plasmodium-infected blood." Scientists from the Department of Molecular Biology and Immunology at the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute in Baltimore, USA, conducted experiments demonstrating how transgenic malarial mosquitoes could potentially live together alongside wild individuals. In the course of the experiments, scientists obtained a comparative description of how the ratio of transgenic and malarial mosquitoes placed in one habitat is changing. They fed both species with the blood of mice infected with malaria. It turned out that genetically engineered insects can live longer than their wild counterparts. As a result of the experiment, after a change of 9 generations of mosquitoes, about 70% of the total number turned out to be transgenic. That is, this technique also works, which means that it is impossible to stop further developments. I cannot help mentioning the superficially curious conclusions that researchers made in the process of fighting malaria. I especially remember the episode when scientists from Tanzania created a new type of mosquito trap. Do you know what its main ingredient was? The smell of human feet. And for the experiment, dirty socks were used, which the volunteers wore for 10 hours. Do you think it's a real chemical attack? No, because it turned out that this particular smell attracts almost 4 times more mosquitoes, not only malarial ones. And, according to the American Emory University, mosquitoes are crazy about the smell of beer. Therefore, scientists have proposed to lure insects into such a trap and kill them with an insecticide that the socks are soaked with. When mosquitoes tried to suck the blood out of the poison-soaked socks, 95% of them died instantly. We hope for our remedy to become another powerful weapon against malaria, says Dr. Friedros Okuma. On the other hand, why not consider this option? In the war against a deadly disease, no holds were barred. Scientists have also found that malarial mosquitoes avoid close contact with domestic chickens for some reason, so much so that the smell of this bird instills panic in them. We were quite surprised when we discovered this fact, Professor Rickard Ignell from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences says. Experiments have shown that mosquitoes won't feed on the blood of certain animal species and are guided by smells. The researchers even set up special traps using chicken feathers in some and feathers from other bird species and tufts of animal fur in others. It turned out that none of the fauna representatives repels malarial mosquitoes like an ordinary chicken. Scientists have put forward 2 versions of what is happening. Either the fact that the chickens hunt mosquitoes and eat them is significant, or the mosquitoes just cannot digest the blood of chickens. Experiments in this direction continue. Perhaps we're on the point of a sensational discovery and a milestone in the treatment of malaria. The scientists also observed why mosquitoes are sometimes not affected by toxins and insecticides. It's all about the chemical characteristics of the receptors of the paws of this species of insect, which resist chemicals. But after subjecting gene changes to the genome of the Anopheles gambiae malarial mosquito, the researchers ensured that its intestines suddenly began to produce antimicrobial peptides, the very ones that scientists isolated from African bees and frogs, influencing the development of Plasmodium, slowing down its development. These substances led to a reduction in the life of the malarial mosquito. Yes, before I forget, fans of interesting theories about the impact of diseases on humanity, I advise you to read the book by Canadian historian Timothy K. Weingard, Mosquitoes, the Story of the Deadliest Predator That Ever Threatened Humanity. According to the author, it was because of these insects that dinosaurs could die out, and mosquitoes could also help create modern Great Britain. So, in 1698, ships filled with various goods left Scotland for Panama. The navigators planned to create a trade route that could unite the ocean space and therefore boost the country's development. But there was a bit of trouble. During the voyage, crew members began to die from infections carried by mosquitoes, and the mortality rate was very high, up to 12 people a day. Half a year on the road resulted in half of the crew having been killed by malaria. The bodies of the dead were thrown overboard to avoid the spread of infection. The survivors returned home high and dry, and Scotland was forced to accept the British offer of unification because financially they had suffered greatly from the failed mission. But again, This is only the historian's theory. Similarly, Weingard believes that Columbus's discovery of America was not without malarial mosquitoes, in the sense that before the arrival of the colonialists, the insects were practically harmless, but foreign blood intervened. So, 22 years after the discovery of America, it turned out that the number of indigenous people in the region, the Taipo Indian people, decreased from 5.9 million people to a miserable 26,000. There is a version that this terrible depopulation occurred precisely from diseases carried by malarial mosquitoes. The historian also writes that these insects once had a significant impact on the slave trade. In the 17th and 18th century, a slave was priced according to how capable he was of enduring mosquito-borne diseases, and therefore representatives of African tribes who during their lives managed to get malaria more than once and often acquired immunity to it were the most expensive. At the same time, Weingard believes that, in general, malarial mosquitoes have been the most deadly living organism on Earth for the entire time of their existence, and have killed at least 52 billion people. That is, about half of the total number of people who have inhabited our planet for all the time of its existence. The figure, of course, causes some skepticism, although in principle, few people would argue with the fact that malaria has indeed had a significant impact on the course of world history. Unfortunately, it still has it now. If we talk about real data instead of official ones, which for various reasons are often underestimated, scientists confirm that at the beginning of the 21st century, 350 to 500 million of malaria cases were recorded on the planet per year. Of these, at least 1.5 to 3 million ended in death. If you think the situation is changing radically with the development of science and medicine, this is not at all the case. That is, of course, scientists managed to reduce the percentage of both those infected and those who die of malaria, but these are not the indicators that could be considered satisfactory. Especially in Africa, where high mortality from this disease in children under 5 years old is still recorded. They still do not have time to acquire immunity. At this stage, malaria is still widespread throughout the world and affects about 100 states, which are home to more than half of the world's population. Just think about it. Billions of people are at risk every day. These are mainly residents of Africa, as well as India, Colombia, Vietnam, Brazil, and Sri Lanka. Since 2018, the World Health Organization has identified 4 countries that are free from malaria: Argentina, Paraguay, Algeria, and Uzbekistan. Only 4 of all countries on Earth. It remains to acknowledge that the entire modern arsenal of knowledge of scientists, medical ideas, discoveries, and developments are not capable of completely eradicating the disease which claimed the lives of such world-famous personalities as Christopher Columbus, who discovered America, the great conquerors Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great, the famous British poet George Byron, a number of popes. Imagine how many outstanding figures of science, arts, and politics mankind could have lost during malaria outbreaks, and how many more will yet be lost. The 21st century is the time to prove that people are capable of fighting the most terrible and deadly diseases that are killing the world's population at too high a rate. Despite the emergence of new types of vaccines and medications, the process does not stop. Plasmodium is the type of microorganism that can mutate and evolve to keep on bringing death. Therefore, the struggle with it has become so long and painful for our planet. Let's remember that malaria is not the only disease that threatens humanity with extermination. And if we still want and strive to survive in the face of danger that nature itself imposes, we will have to make an effort. There can only be one winner in this fight. It is to be hoped that the strongest will still be a human. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.